Welcome to this March webinar entitled Zach and Mia Dealing with Life's Greatest Challenges. I'm returning to a mode of creating webinars with this month's webinar because I watched a video series on Netflix called Zach and Mia, and I was particularly intrigued by it because of its very thorough coverage of what happens to people when they face really big challenges in life. Now, most of us spend most of our lives with only minor challenges or relatively small challenges, minor crises that come up um, that we deal with, and then they're gone. But most of us also, at some time in our life, face a major challenge. Now, some people face major challenges throughout their lives. They're born with a handicap, or they acquire a disease, or have an accident, or something happens to them that creates a situation that basically they are challenged physically and emotionally, and sometimes intellectually um, throughout their lives. And that's a particular kind of challenge. And I've seen many wonderful examples of how people have dealt successfully with those challenges. I remember one movie I saw based on, I think it was a girl that was in France, but don't quote me, called My Left Foot. Um, and she was, I don't know what the word for it is, but basically paralyzed in three limbs and unable to speak, and was regarded basically as just hopeless. But was raised by this family, and she was the youngest, at least at that point, of a number of siblings. And somewhere along the way, when the child was maybe 3 or 4, maybe a little bit older, I can't remember exactly, it was recognized that the child was paying attention to things and was trying to interact by using the only limb that worked, which was her left leg and foot. And she did eventually, the kids started working with her, and she did eventually learn to actually write with her left foot and was able to communicate quite effectively. Um, I can't remember if they used a letter board so that she could tap it with her foot and indicate which which letters she wanted to use to express herself. But she did and became a functioning human being after basically the medical authorities, and I think the parents even had basically given up on her, and were just keeping her alive and keeping her clean. But it turned out that she did very well. So some people have that kind of incredible life challenge that's a lifelong thing, and overcome it enormously. Of course, we all know the story of Helen Keller. It's another wonderful example of somebody with deafness who eventually overcame that and became quite an author. Um, this particular story, Zach and Mia, is about two kids, two teenagers with cancer, and they have different kinds of cancer and are in different stages of their experience with that. Zach has non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and he is he's failed chemotherapy, so to speak. That is, the chemotherapy failed him, didn't get rid of his tumor, and so he had a bone marrow transplant after an extensive. Basically, what they do is knock out all the cells, all the immune cells, and then they replace them. And so he's in 100 days of isolation. And he describes at the beginning of the series the X factor, and I think that's a good way to start and introduce this topic. And the X factor is what life brings that is beyond expectation. We all, if we're really aware of things, we expect some difficulties, some challenges in life, but we pretty much have our lives in control. Even as teenagers, we're managing, and we're growing and developing and learning to experience and cope with experience and so on. But the X factor is the thing that we just couldn't anticipate. It can be cancer or any other serious illness, and particularly life-threatening illnesses, because they have their own special quality. Childhood diabetes would be one, where you're probably going to survive if you take care of yourself, but it is an enormous hassle. Sudden loss of a close relative or friend, particularly if it was unexpected, as in an accident or by suicide. But lots of people lose parents and other loved ones, siblings, even at an early age, or at least before they're adults. And it's quite traumatic. And of course, even as adults, it's still often very traumatic. But then there are other things like natural disasters, huge financial setbacks, violence, and which can be very frightening, even if we don't lose somebody close to us. The mere fact of violence in our communities, which may be just neighborhood stuff or gang-related stuff, or it could be something like war, and we have huge numbers of people in the world displaced by war, and that's just a gigantic challenge. So forced displacement is another enormous challenge. And then not quite forced displacement that may come from emigration, leaving one's country. The U.S. is experiencing an influx of people from Central and South America who are leaving because their conditions in their home environments are so terrible. And many right now, it's children are trying to cross the border into the United States and basically overwhelming our capacity to process them adequately, even in a now much less hostile receptive environment. That is, that we have a receptivity. Just finding the facilities and finding places to put kids, if they have relatives, to find those relatives and try to get them to them, or to find foster type care for them. This is really straining the system at this point. So this kind of either forced displacement or emigration, leaving one's home country or home state and moving often a great distance, and like coming to the United States, to a land where you don't speak the language, you don't know the customs, and only recently, at least slightly more welcome than they were over the last 4 years. So those are the kinds of things, the things that come unexpectedly, the X factors, where we can say life would be normal except for. And the fourth thing, the thing that's causing this challenge, is so enormous as to really disrupt our life. And oftentimes, um, a whole bunch of things happen to us really at the beginning. One is a shattered sense of identity. Our plans are put on hold. Our social activities are limited or non existent, or completely redefined. Um, you find yourself saying, I'm now this. I'm a cancer victim. I'm a war victim. I'm impoverished where I was before I was affluent, or at least comfortable. And we wind up identifying with the disease. We label ourselves as this disease or this problem, this challenge that we have. And that's a very interesting but kind of peculiar thing. It's sort of an example of the Stockholm syndrome, where we stop being ourself and we become the person that fits the situation. And the Stockholm syndrome is where the victims actually um, identify with the perpetrators of the, usually it's kidnappings, and other things that go on, um, and may even develop sympathy for them. They develop understanding of why these people are doing what they're doing, or this person is doing what they're doing. And so they're, like in criminal situations, they're often reluctant to testify against the perpetrator. So that's Stockholm syndrome. But when we're sick or we've had an accident or any of these other things that I listed, our identity shifts from being the person, whatever we were in a society and whatever age we were, and so on. And now we are this thing. And people see us that way. It gets reinforced, and very strongly so. And it's impossible to get out of it. It feels like it's impossible to get out of it if we even desire to. It's like it won't go away. We've lost our home, or we have this disease, or whatever it is. If that's the way it is, pardon me. And everybody is saying you have to learn to live with it, to adjust to it, to accept the fact that that's the reality. So we have this shattered sense of identity. There's also a change in the personal boundaries and personal space, which is often violated by virtue of the changing circumstances. All of a sudden, there are these new people in our lives, and they're not always friendly, and may in fact be very hostile, or they're desperate for their own identity. And so, in the movie Mia, when they first meet, in the first day they meet, Mia has a speaker for her iPhone so she can play the music and hear it without using headphones. And it's loud. I mean, she plays it very loudly. And Zach's on the other side of the wall in his room in the hospital. And so they have their initial meeting is kind of contentious. And of course, he can't leave his room because he's in isolation. So they have a thing through the window where they kind of, you know, chew each other out. And she gives in a little bit and turns the music down, and eventually goes to using her earphones so that she doesn't disturb him. But this sense of loss of personal space and loss of control over who's in your space and what's going on in your space is an enormous thing. And it's very depersonalizing, very difficult to live with. And then there's the social isolation that comes with it. If you're displaced, you may have family and friends around you, but you're in a whole different environment. And it may not be that you're living in a different place. If you have cancer or something like that, you may be in the hospital. And boy, I tell you, being in the hospital with anything, violation of your space, your boundaries, people are coming in and out of your room to make sure you're still alive, even at 4 o'clock in the morning, and waking you up and taking your vital signs, and that's not fun at all. So you lose sleep, and God knows there's no privacy. And now, where you may have been a fairly modest person before, basically are on public display. And so, there's just all of these things that go on that violate your sense of identity, your boundaries, your personal space. Um, that are there's extreme part of the challenge of being sick isn't just that you're sick, it's all this stuff that goes with it. um and for Zach, he was very much in isolation. He's literally in isolation for 100 days, and the only people that are allowed in are his immediate family members and of course the hospital staff. And that's really rough on Zach. He's a social person, and although Mia is not in that same isolation, she's in the hospital for treatment. She's getting chemotherapy. And so that brings an automatic isolation. And besides which, she feels awful. Zach, for better or worse, doesn't feel awful. And that's one of the hard things about being in isolation like that. But, think of people in a refugee camp. Here you got all these people in your personal space. You have no personal space, and oftentimes you don't know who they are, or you only know a few of them. And there's just all this pressure, of the intimacy, the physical intimacy of everything. It's so intense. Um, Family members are also under a lot of pressure, and this is one of the points that's brought out early in the series. For Zach, it's his brother and sister. His brother is older, just slightly. His sister just slightly younger, so they're very close together in age. Um, and they kind of take turns spending nights with him, and they visit him every day. One or the other of them, at least, visits him every day. Um, and what Zach doesn't realize is that they basically give up their lives, or very nearly so. And they're spending so much time with him. They're so worried about him. They're so attentive to everything that happens. The parents, um, not so present. Mia's mother particularly. If dad doesn't seem to exist, and mom, just can't deal, just can't deal. Um, and so parents and family members have their own reactions. Now, Zach sees himself as the person who has to keep it together. And so he doesn't talk very much about what he's going through. He puts on a good face because he feels that his siblings and parents need that from him. And so there's a general lack of communication about what people are going through. And in fact, Zach's sister winds up going to the cancer support group, not because she has cancer. She's not younger, except by a couple of minutes. She's a twin sister, which made the story kind of interesting, because she is really, really connected to him. And so she winds up going to the cancer support group in the hospital because she needs to be able to talk about what she herself is going through, not what he's going through, but what she's going through. And so one of the things that we need to think about when we're going through something is what's going on with the people in our lives? What are they experiencing? And are we communicating to them? Are we being at all honest with them? Are we sharing with them the consequence of social isolation and identity, loss of identity, and violation of boundaries and personal space? Um, I thought of a funny story. I'm trying to think whether or not I should actually tell it. Um, One of the funny experiences I had is when I was in my training as a pediatrician. Our department, pediatric department, took care of a adolescent um, who had a seizure disorder, and that's not a thing a kid wants to live with. She didn't have seizures all the time, so she was doing pretty well, but she wanted to be a teenager, and so she had gone out and the kids had some beer, and so she had some beer, and she had a seizure. And unfortunately, her friends panicked and brought her to the ER because if they just left her for a few minutes, she would have been fine. And she was fine when we saw her, but we had to check her over because she had arrived in the ER. So we had to check her over, and um, she we needed to do a physical exam. And when I say we, I think I was with a senior resident at that point. I think I was an intern, first year resident in pediatrics. And so we just said, we need to do a physical exam. And she said, "Oh, that I don't mind. I lost my virginity in the hospital a long time ago." And the two of us, we were both men, and the two of us just looked at her for a few seconds. And then she realized what she had said. She said, "I mean, I lost my modesty." Yeah. So anyway, and she was actually very easy to examine in that way. She wasn't uptight. She'd been examined so many times, but it was a funny experience. Of course, she was still a little bit inebriated at the time. So anyway, pressures on family members around whatever it is that's going on. Now, if it's a shared experience, that means everybody's going through it, and maybe it's dad or mom or one of maybe the oldest child that has to be the strong one. And maybe the others are, kind of suffering and keeping it inside if they can, and sometimes falling apart. In this story, Zach has to be the strong one, and Mia is very much on her own. Her mother's just not very supportive. Um, so there's just a lot of that kind of thing going on. Gee, I better move along here. Another theme in the story is the quest for it's they called it friends, but it's connection with people. Everything's different now. You're in this case, you're sick. They could have been injured or whatever it was, or maybe you've lost wealth, um, and now you're poor and struggling, and so you don't want people to know that things are so bad, and so you're kind of cut off. And so then the thing comes, how do you reach out and find people in this time of need when you're feeling broken, when you're feeling really hurt, and when you need some source of hope and something to give you the will to keep going? And finding that will to keep going can be very, very difficult. And a lot of people don't make it. They just succumb in one way or another. to the situation, and they may wind up either dead or, just on the streets, so to speak. We have a lot of homeless people who just they can't function, and partly because of mental illness, and then oftentimes with that isolation comes drug use, and then that just is further debilitating, along with poor nutrition and a lack of safety and a whole bunch of other things. So life can get really a mess. And one thing you see in those people is a lack of ability to reach out, a lack of trusting, a lack of even knowledge of uh, how to ask for something, and a willingness to do so. And boy, in the last 4 years, we've seen this ethic of, you have to take care of yourself. I'm going to call it the Ted Cruz syndrome. Things get bad, go somewhere where it's better, leave everybody else to take care of themselves. And that was that's the Ted Cruz syndrome. Kind of make that name stick. Um, it's not, we can judge it right or wrong, but it's an attitude. It's just a way of dealing. So a lot of people just leave when they're in that kind of crisis, rather than dealing with it. Another thing they have to deal with is simply the uncertainty, the unpredictability. They may try to cope with that with facts, figures, trying to get knowledge, trying to get information. But it's generally hard to say what course of action or what direction to take is going to be best. Um, I think a lot about the people who emigrated from other countries and came here because we basically are today a country built of immigrants. And for those who were not forced out, literally thrown out, but who had to flee for safety, um, which included my ancestors, um, the decision to leave and to go off with some vague notion that things were going to be better somewhere else, that's a really huge one. And the risk that's involved in that, the uncertainty that is involved in that, is gigantic. And people, millions of people came to this country, many of them through Ellis Island. And I remember pictures of, halls on Ellis Island crowded with immigrants getting processed. And that happened at many different times. Um, they may have had some hope, that the American streets were paved with gold and everything was going to be fine. But they had to have also known that they're coming to a place they often didn't speak the language. Most of them came poor, no money, literally a suitcase, a satchel, perhaps, and that's all they had, and their wits, as they said, you know, to try and make it work. Excuse me. That helped. Um, and so, they had to figure out where to go and what to do. Sometimes there are organizations, you came from a certain area, you spoke a certain language. Oh, we'll help you. We know people who can put you up and help you get a job and find your way. I had an uncle that came to this country as a refugee in the Second World War. Um, and I think he actually arrived here because he went to several different places. He arrived here right after the Second World War, and he got in touch with an agency, or they found him or something, and they said, "Well, we have job openings in I think it was Des Moines and Kansas City." And he hardly knew the names. Probably didn't even know Des Moines. He might have heard of Kansas City. And he said, "Well, I have no basis for choosing." And so they said, "Well, in this country, we just flip a coin." So they flipped the coin, and he got Des Moines, and eventually wound up marrying into my family. Um, and so he wound up ultimately being an uncle for me. But it was very interesting, that his destiny was literally worked out by an agency and a flip of a coin, and an opportunity for a job and eventually life, and a good life. And to his dying day, he absolutely grateful, not just grateful, but I mean like completely grateful for what had happened to him. He had escaped literally through a tunnel under the German border to get into Holland, the Netherlands, and eventually to, I think, Holland, it may have been Belgium, but eventually to get to England, and then eventually to the United States. And so he was most fortunate, and he was completely grateful. He understood that he could have died there in Germany. He could have died trying to get through that tunnel. The Germans patrolled with dogs because the dogs could hear, people crawling through tunnels. The Germans didn't know where the tunnels were, of course, but they knew that they existed, and so they would patrol along the border. And the crawling through the tunnel had to be done when the Germans weren't there, and so the people would be watching out of dark windows, and then they go like, okay, now you can go through the tunnel. And he was a big man and barely fit. He had broad shoulders, and the tunnel was extremely small and very claustrophobic. That's another story. Anyway, dealing with the uncertainty and how one deals with the uncertainty. Zach does it with facts and figures. Mia does it primarily by retreating into a fantasy and then realizing that it is a fantasy and that she doesn't have what she wants. And so she has a very hard time. And Zach knows what he wants, but he can't do it because he's locked up, like in jail, but he's not really locked up. But he's in isolation for 100 days. And of course, the number is arbitrary, 100. It could be 99, but they made it 100 because it's a round number. And so basically, his numbers, meaning his lab work, is good, but he can't leave. He does eventually sneak out. Then he gets sick. And then he feels guilty and he kind of wishes he'd die, but he didn't, or doesn't at least. And his family's all angry at him for being stupid and foolish. But all it was that he was just desperate. He was just desperate for some fun because life was not fun and it had not been fun for a really long time. Does that sound like going through COVID pandemic here? And, most of us are very much isolated and, feeling lonely at times and feeling frustrated and feeling like, God, it'd really be nice to go out and have a meal with some folks or hang out with some folks or whatever we do together, as a party or get together. And you can't do it, because you got to protect your family or yourself. I certainly of an age that, you know, theoretically of some risk. I tend to take pretty good care of myself, but, you know, was kind of a concern at that time. So, yeah, there's very real things that have to be dealt with. And one of the problems that people come up with is, do I just follow convention? Do I do what's expected of me, what I think is expected of me? Do I do what society demands of me? And when I say society, it may just be a little microcosm of society. Or do I choose the unconventional? And, sometimes we find ourselves in situations where that people ask the worst question. I hate the question, is everything okay? When it obviously isn't. Instead of saying something like, you look worried or concerned or unhappy, is there anything I can do to help? They usually say no, but you say, well, how about if I did this or I did that? And then they go like, yeah, that actually would be nice, but sometimes people can't even think of that. The problem is we make social lies and we do it all the time and we put on a face. We say what's expected instead of, and what people want, instead of saying what we need to say, instead of being real. So we just retreat and just avoid contact. And that's what Zach does a great deal is he lies about what's going on inside him. And when he really needs support, he gets it because his brother and sister are so attentive to him. He gets wonderful support. And they're really great with him. But it's very, very hard on them because he's being the strong one, and he's putting on the face. And so the lies go on. And so we're lying. Mia lies to her social network on Facebook or whatever. She even lies about what's going on with her. She claims to be off in New York, um, going to a show or something, um, when she's in the hospital fighting cancer. Eventually, her friends find out, um, and you know, then she finally, one of the things she does in the her arc in the story is to be able to admit it. And she finally puts a post up on social media that says, "It's not true. I wasn't in New York. I've been fighting cancer. It's been hell, and I'm here all by myself." By that time, she's lost most of her friends because now she's a liar, and they don't, you know. But some of them come and try to help her out. Um, Being in this circumstance, I've got just a few more things I wanted to share. Being in this circumstance is endless stress. It's like it's unrelenting. Every day, every night, every minute is stress. Sometimes it's a stress to get out of bed and go to the bathroom. It's very hard for Mia. She winds up with an amputation. You know, she can't she can't navigate for a while. Finally, she does. She learns how to do it. But initially, she's kind of trapped in the bed. She has to ask for help just to get up to get to the bathroom. One of the things about stress is that it has a way of sorting out our true friends from those who, aren't so committed. Now, sometimes people drop away because they're just too frightened or just don't know how to deal. They're just not equipped to deal with that. And that's not at all a rare thing. And oftentimes those people feel very, very guilty. They abandon somebody and they go like, I had to. I couldn't face it. I couldn't go in the room and say, how are you doing? This has got to be tough. They couldn't be strong in that way and just be an ear or a shoulder to lean on, or cry on. They just couldn't handle that. So stress is a huge influence here. Um, it certainly sorts out the weak and the strong. And one of the lessons you have to learn is to be compassionate for those who are weak, including yourself, and not overly. I don't know what the word would be. Revere. That's not a bad word. Not to overly revere those who are strong. Um, you don't have to be strong for those who are weak. You can be real because that gives them an opportunity to be real also. That's a really big point. If you're real, they can be real. If you're not real, they can't be real. So this thing about being strong is really or weak is really an issue. And it's very, very hard to resolve on your own. Um, it's okay if you're aware of it, but most people aren't. And so they need a counselor, a support person. A support group can be very helpful that way because they can find their strength in the group. And, the old line, thank you so much for sharing. Maybe you don't, but anyway, it's a support group kind of thing. And the sharing can be very valuable. Just the fact that you can say that to somebody else or a group of people and they accept it. They just accept it for what it is. Yeah. Yeah. We're all going through that. We understand. And it's nice to know, like, hey, I'm not alone. I'm not alone. This is difficult. I'm going to get through it. Anyway, the stress is like every day. It goes on and on without end. And that's really tough. And it's emotionally exhausting to the point of you feel like you're not able to go on. You just don't have it anymore. And I'm sure you've all heard people say that. Parents say that sometimes, perfectly normal parents, right? They got these kids, and these kids have to be fed and clothed and entertained and, cleaned up after. And then there's conflicts, the kids are fighting amongst themselves or with you, they're resisting what you want and so on and so forth. So just normal life can be very stressful that goes on and on and on. 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 And and forgive ourselves too. Another aspect of this social disruption that goes on is that you realize that everything is tempting. Doors close, and it doesn't always look like other doors open. I saw this great joke the other day. It said, the only place that, or it says, if you're having the experience that doors close behind you and doors open in front of you, you're in prison. Because that's what it's like, right? You go through two layers of doors. You have to be aware of that, or the joke isn't funny, right? But the only place where, or if you find yourself in the experience that doors are closing and other doors are opening, you're in prison. But it really shows the nature of dealing with a great challenge. It's like doors are closing, and sometimes there aren't doors opening. There are people, if you think about it, people trapped in refugee camps for years now, many of them from Syria, from Sudan, from Kuwait, and many other places in the world that, people have fled. They've been nominally taken care of, but basically rounded up in some other location, maybe fed, maybe educated, maybe given medical care. Um, but oftentimes it's extremely difficult and there's basically no escape. You're just trapped in. One of the things that comes out in the story, besides changes in personal appearance and dealing with that, what is it like to lose your hair? And then what it's like to have it grow back in, and what do you do with that? When Mia meets Zach, Zach is bald. Later in the story, Mia goes bald and is losing her hair, and the lovely nurse, it's a man, um, shaves it off for her. So she's wearing a bandana scarf around her head, and Zach's hair is growing in. He's got some fuzz now, and you can tell, that he has hair. um, but Zach finds himself in a situation, and it's also a big issue in dealing with serious challenges, and that is, he gives advice to one of his close friends, very close friends, and it turns out poorly, and the guy dies. He told the guy to get surgery, and the guy doesn't make it through surgery, and the guilt is overwhelming. Um, in my business, I try really hard not to give advice um, for various reasons, but one of them is I don't want to feel guilty if it doesn't work out. I avoid that, but also because generally it's better for people to discover their own path, and my job is to show them things about their path to help them make their decisions and feel their way through it. And then it's very genuine for them, and it works. It tends to work very well. Another big point that gets brought out in here is that everybody handles the hard stuff, like bad news, differently. Zach's way of dealing with it is to shut people out. He just deals with it on his own. Mia lies. Together, they scheme. They do stuff. It's called acting out when you're talking about kids. But basically, yeah, they try to meet their needs by doing things they're not supposed to do. And that has repercussions, of course. And mostly because people's concern for them. That is, the repercussions aren't because they violated a rule. They did violate a rule, but the rule was there for their well-being. And so people get angry because they're going like, we don't want to lose you, right? You don't want you to get sick. Another thing that happens in crisis, and it's a very special thing, is that you learn that most of the time, the things you cared about in your life before are really pretty trivial. Because when you're facing a major challenge, particularly an existential challenge, a life-threatening challenge, the things you're dealing with are the things that are going to affect the outcome. Whereas in our day-to-day lives, we don't usually think of them in terms of, well, am I going to get enlightened in this lifetime? And am I focused on that? And it's like, well, if I do this, it may slow me down in my evolution. So, I won't do that. But then we sometimes make ourselves unhappy by that. We deny ourselves possibilities for relative happiness. And so um, we can get desperate for a little bit of happiness. And we can get angry that we can't have what we think we want. Sometimes we do crazy, stupid things. You've all done it. Come on, admit it. Um, they give a moment of relief and then they make it worse sometimes. A few final insights and then we'll move on to the group clearing session. One is that when you're going through a challenge, everything that's happening to you is happening to everyone you love, who loves you, who cares about you at the exact same time. And that's really hard to grasp. It's one of those things that we just don't share in our culture. People just don't know that that's literally true. If it's happening to us, it's affecting everybody who cares about us to some degree. And most of the time, they don't show it, and we don't show it. And that can generally be counterproductive. Being candid is almost always better than not. Now, people who are more distant, yeah, they don't necessarily have to be involved. But if we're not honest with the people, not candid with the people who are close to us, who care about us, then we tend to suffer. And I've watched that. Gosh, I've studied a fair amount of family therapy. It's one of the fundamental tenets of family therapy, the secrets that people are keeping. But secrets return to haunt us. Honesty and candor may not come naturally, but pretty much it's essential. Because when we keep secrets, and I know families, and of course, there's all kinds of, stories written about family secrets. When people keep secrets, it really disrupts the family dynamics. It really makes things bad. People keep secrets because they're embarrassed. People keep secrets for power. Um, there's all kinds of reasons. It doesn't matter what the reasons are. It's the doing of it that tends to mess things up. So that's one of the insights. Another one is you have to take care of yourself so that you can be with others. That is not to say you can't let other people help take care of you, but you do have to take care of yourself. Otherwise, you really can't be with others. So, and a lot of times we don't have the skills. We just don't know how to do it. And we don't know to ask. And we don't know that if we ask, then it can be better for us. And then one final one, it's the last one I think in the series that is just so beautiful. And the way they phrased it in the show was our star shines to say to others, our star shines to say to others that you aren't alone. There's a part of us that glows like a star, so others know they aren't alone, that we are here with them. And I thought that was just a really beautiful way to end the story. I won't tell you how it comes out. I recommend, if you have Netflix, Zach and Mia is the name. I strongly recommend that you go see it. So it's gotten quite late, so I'm going to stop the recording